week before last, we saw where Joseph, who was second in command of all of Egypt, had finally revealed himself to his brothers. They had sold him into slavery some 21 years ago. They hated their brother so much, they said, I wish he was dead. My little brother's driving me nuts. Those of you who have little brothers and little sisters, y'all know it aggravates sometimes. But these guys hated him so much they wanted him dead, so they sold him. And Joseph could have reacted a lot of ways to that. You know, he could have been bitter. He could have been angry. He could have caused his brothers a lot more grief than he did because Joseph was the second in command of all of Egypt. Through all of that, God had led him into a place where he was second in command of all of Egypt. He was in charge of all the food distribution. But Joseph, being led by the hand of God, he tested him. I mean, yeah, he tested him a little bit, but he wasn't showing it through bitterness. He was seeing if these brothers were the same brothers that had sold him into slavery 21 years ago, or had their hearts changed. Were they different? Had God changed them over the years? And so he didn't take revenge on them. He tested them to see if their hearts had changed. And after testing them multiple times, it seemed to Joseph that these brothers were a little bit different. Well, they were a lot different. They didn't seem like they were the same brothers. Their guilt that they had carried all these years had weighed heavy on them. And so once Joseph revealed himself to these brothers that, hey, it's me. I'm the guy that you sold into slavery. I'm the guy that you hated so much. And they began to have a chance to reconcile and catch up. And then Joseph sent them all home with provisions and said, hey, go bring my dad. I want to see my dad. Go home, get your father, bring him back. Here's all the provisions you need for your trip. Here's all the provisions you need for your animals. Everything you need is right here. Go home, get my dad, bring him back. And so he brought all their family back with him. Now, the famine was nowhere near over. This was year 2 of a 7-year famine. So they had a lot of a road left ahead of them. And Joseph had prepared a place in Goshen for his family where they could live and survive the next 5 years of the famine. And when Joseph's family finally arrived, they had a great reunion. They wept. They embraced each other. And Jacob had believed all these years that his son Joseph was dead because that's what his brothers told him. When they sold him into slavery, they took his robe, his favorite robe that his dad had made him because he was his favorite son, and they took it and they killed an animal and put blood all over it and said, a wild animal has attacked Joseph and just took him off. He's gone. He's dead. Knowing full well the whole time they sold him. And now Jacob lays his eyes on his son for the first time in 21 years. And this was a special, special moment between father and son. Big deal for Joseph and for Jacob. And now that they're in Egypt under Joseph's care, Joseph needs to go to Pharaoh. He needs to tell him that his family's in Egypt and that they're shepherds. And they brought all their livestock. They brought everything they own with them. And he tells his brothers in the last part of chapter 46 exactly what to say. He says, if Pharaoh comes to you and says anything, asks you a question, this is what you need to say. He said, you need to tell them that you're shepherds and you've done it all your life just like your fathers did. That's what you need to tell them. If Pharaoh asks you anything, that's what you need to say. You've tended livestock all your life just as your fathers did. Joseph had a plan in all of this. With God's wisdom that he had given him, he had a plan through all of this. And so he knew a lot of things about Egyptian culture because when he got sold to Egypt, I mean, he had to learn to be like the Egyptians. And he looked like the Egyptians. He spoke Egyptian. And so he did all these things, and he knew how they lived. He knew how they regarded shepherds. And so he had a plan in every bit of this. And he knew that shepherds are detestable to all Egyptians. That sounds bad, don't it? The shepherds were detestable. Would you like to be somewhere where everybody viewed you as detestable? But this was still a time, it was another provision by God for God's people of Israel. Egyptians didn't really associate with any other culture. Everyone else was considered less than. If you weren't Egyptian, you just weren't cool. They didn't want to be around you. So, we learned that a few weeks back because we talked about how the Egyptians never sat at a table and ate with shepherds or anybody of any other ethnicity. They just didn't sit with them. And Joseph, even when he was pretending to be Egyptian, because his brothers didn't know who he was. He knew who they were, but they didn't know him. They didn't recognize him. And he sat at a table and ate by himself while his brothers dined together, because they couldn't eat together. Egyptians just didn't do that. And so they ate these different tables. That's just how their culture was. And so they all ate at different times, different places, and would not sit together. And especially shepherds were detestable to these Egyptians, and they were looked down upon. But Joseph, being that God is directing him, has some great insight as to what's going to happen. And we'll see in the next chapter exactly why he had them tell him that you're shepherds. And we're not going to get to that part today, but this is why he has prepped his brothers so they will know what to say. And I'm sure they're a little nervous because they're going to go see the Pharaoh of Egypt. They're in a foreign land. They've come there because Joseph has called them there, and they're going to go meet with Pharaoh and say, can we live here? They still have to ask for permission. Even though Joseph is second in command of Egypt, he can pretty much do whatever he wants. I mean, he is in charge of all of Pharaoh's stuff, but yet they still have to go ask for permission to live there. So it'd be kind of weird to go up and say, hey, we're here to live here. We brought all our stuff. We brought our family. We brought our animals. Can we have that little pasture over there? That'd be cool. And so here's where we pick up in Genesis 47, starting in verse 1. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan, and they're now in Goshen. He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, what is your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. They also said to him, we have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know any among them with special ability, this is key. If you know any of those in special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. And then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. And so the King James Version says, my years have been few and evil. So then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. And Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. So, as I said, Joseph could pretty much do whatever he wanted in Egypt because of his position. But they still had to ask for permission to live there. And when they were asked, Joseph's brothers said exactly what they told him to say. They followed orders. They did good. And there wasn't one person that said, well, I don't do that. I don't herd sheep. I'm not doing that no more. I've done that my whole life. They did exactly what he told them to say. They said, we are shepherds. We've tended livestock our whole life just as our fathers have done. When that happened, he just secured his brothers a job as caretaker of all of Pharaoh's livestock. I mean, that's going to be, you'll see next week how important that is as we go dive into the rest of this chapter, because we're not going to make it more than verse 12 today, but they had been shepherd all their lives, and they would be able to be shepherds and dwell in the best land in Egypt. I mean, y'all look at, if y'all watch Westerns, you watch Open Range, and you see those places that have these beautiful pastures, and you're like, man, I'd love to live there. I saw an ad for a piece of property in Montana last night that was like, I don't remember how many acres it was. It was like 16,000 acres. It was a crazy amount of money. But I was like, that's where I want to live, I mean, that would be awesome. And these guys are they're coming into a country getting the best land available to them for shepherding. It's that perfect piece of pasture that you always wanted. That's where these guys get. That is because of the provisions and the sovereignty of God. He put them in a place where they would be protected and sheltered as God's people, and they could grow to be who God needs them to be. These are the future Israelites, the nation of Israel, and God is protecting them now and already in this time. So they would be able to be shepherds and dwell in the best land of Egypt. The great blessing that was happening was because of Joseph. Joseph had and his brothers, Joseph had really just came in when his brothers sold him and he got put in second charge of Egypt. He saved the whole country of Egypt. Matter of fact, he saved the whole world because everybody is coming to Egypt to get food. You see how God used him to provide food during a time when nobody else had any. Nothing would grow. There was no way they could harvest. And you'll see even more how severe it was when we get into next week's. But it was a bad time. And because God gave him the wisdom and the ability to interpret a dream that Pharaoh had, Joseph saved everybody. Because not only did he interpret the dream that God gave Pharaoh, he had a plan. God gave him the wisdom to know what to do and when to do it. And he trusted God. He was obedient to God. So people came from all over to purchase grain from Egypt, just like his brothers had came from Canaan to purchase food. And now this family of Israel was being blessed and receiving inheritance because of Joseph and his obedience to God. So he brings his father in to meet Pharaoh. And so he brings Jacob in. Jacob tells Pharaoh that the years of his pilgrimage are 130. So he's 130 years old. But this is an interesting choice of words when he says pilgrimage. You think pilgrims, we automatically think of Thanksgiving and that kind of things, because that's all in school we talked about pilgrims. But he's talking about pilgrimage. And pilgrimage is defined as a journey to a sacred place for religious or spiritual reasons. That's kind of unique, isn't it? It's a journey to a sacred place for a religious or spiritual reason. And this is what Jacob is saying. He's like, for 131 years I've lived, I've just been passing through here. This is not my home. I'm just a pilgrim here. I'm sojourner here. And when I was in Canaan, when I was in Egypt, when I was in all these things are temporary homes. Why? Because he knew his real home was somewhere else. Our home is not here on earth. And Jacob understood that. He wasn't talking about Goshen. That's not where his permanent home is, even though he was going to stay there and for a while until he got time to die. But he was talking about heaven with God, his creator. And we don't often think about each of us being pilgrims here, but we are. This is not our home. This is our temporary home. And we are also just passing through here. Every one of us are just passing through. We are sojourners.